Hey everyone, before we dive into this absolutely chilling story from 1841 Louisiana, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we're about to uncover one of the most disturbing tales of revenge and manipulation in American history. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to share this with someone who loves dark historical stories. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single detail of what this 14-year-old boy was capable of. Now let's step back in time to the Deep South, where cotton fields stretched endlessly and something sinister was brewing. My name is Isaac, and I remember the exact moment I stopped being a child. I was 7 years old, standing in the scorching Louisiana sun, watching Master Beauregard's whip tear through Samuel's back like paper. Samuel was my friend, or as close to a friend as any of us could have on Magnolia Plantation. He'd stolen a piece of bread because his little sister was crying from hunger. The whip sang through the air 27 times. I counted every single lash. But what I remember most wasn't Samuel's screams or the blood pooling in the red dirt. It was the way Master Beauregard smiled afterward, wiping sweat from his brow like he'd just finished a satisfying day's work. That smile burned itself into my mind, and something inside me went cold. Permanently cold. The other slaves whispered about me after that day. They said I never blinked anymore, that my eyes had turned into black mirrors that reflected nothing back. Old Mama Ruth, who delivered half the babies on the plantation, would cross herself whenever she saw me. "That child ain't right," she'd mutter. "Got the devil's own stare." She wasn't wrong. I had changed, but not in the way they thought. I'd simply learned to see clearly for the first time in my life. I spent the next 7 years watching, learning, calculating, while other children played with corn-husk dolls or chased fireflies in the evening. I studied the white folks. I memorized their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. I learned that Master Beauregard drank himself stupid every Tuesday night after receiving letters from his creditors. I discovered that his eldest son, Thomas, was stealing money from the plantation accounts to pay gambling debts in New Orleans. I knew that his wife, Mrs. Catherine, was having secret meetings with the Methodist preacher in the old tobacco barn. Knowledge, I realized, was the only weapon a slave could wield without anyone noticing. By the time I turned 14, I could read and write better than most white children, having taught myself by stealing glimpses of newspapers and listening outside the schoolroom window when young Miss Elizabeth had her lessons. I could mimic any accent, from the refined drawl of Charleston aristocrats to the rough patois of Irish dock workers. Most importantly, I'd learned to make myself invisible, not physically, but mentally. White folks looked right through slaves anyway, but I perfected the art of being so unremarkable that even other slaves forgot I was there. The Beauregard family thought they owned me, but they had no idea what they'd created. 7 years of careful observation had taught me that every powerful family in Louisiana was built on lies, secrets, and barely contained hatred. They were all rotten from the inside, held together by nothing more than fear and tradition. All they needed was the right push in the right place, and they'd collapse like houses of cards. I chose the Beauregards to be first because they'd given me my education in cruelty. It seemed only fitting that they'd be the first to learn what I'd done with their lessons. The plan began on a humid August morning when I overheard Thomas arguing with his younger brother William about their father's will. Thomas was convinced he deserved the entire plantation because he was the eldest, while William believed their father favored him because of his military service. The argument was heated but private. They thought they were alone in the study. They weren't. I waited 3 days, then approached William while he was inspecting the cotton fields. I made sure to look nervous, fidgeting with my hat like a typical scared slave boy. "Master William, sir," I said, my voice trembling just right. I heard something I probably shouldn't have, and I don't know what to do." William barely glanced at me. "What is it, boy?" "Well, sir, I was cleaning outside Master Thomas's room yesterday, and I heard him talking to someone about changing your daddy's will. He was saying how you'd never know the difference if certain papers went missing. The lie was perfect because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Thomas was desperate for money, and William was paranoid about his inheritance. I watched William's face change, saw the exact moment suspicion took root. "You're certain of what you heard?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, sir. I wouldn't lie about something like that, Master William." "I know my place." That evening, William confronted Thomas in front of their parents. The accusation led to a screaming match that shattered the family's carefully maintained facade. Thomas, genuinely innocent of this particular crime, was so outraged by the accusation that he revealed several of William's actual secrets in retaliation, including William's affair with a married woman in Baton Rouge and his substantial gambling debts. The fight escalated until Master Beauregard, drunk and furious, declared that neither son was fit to inherit anything. In his rage, he announced he was changing his will to leave everything to his daughter Elizabeth, who was only 16 and completely unprepared for such responsibility. I watched from the shadows as the family tore itself apart, each member now suspicious of the others, each convinced they were being cheated or betrayed. The seed I'd planted grew into a poisonous tree that would strangle them all, but this was just the beginning. The Beauregards were merely practice for what I had planned for the other families. Each one had wronged me or mine in different ways, and each would fall in a manner perfectly suited to their particular sins. As I lay on my straw mattress that night, listening to the sounds of another family argument echoing from the big house, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Satisfaction, not happiness. I wasn't sure I was capable of that anymore, but the deep, cold satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. Tomorrow I would begin working on the Whitmore family. They owned the plantation to the east, where my mother had died from overwork when I was 9. They deserved something special. I closed my eyes and smiled in the darkness. For the first time in 7 years, I slept peacefully. The Whitmore plantation sat like a festering wound on the landscape, its white columns stained yellow with age and neglect. I'd been sold there 6 months after the Beauregard family imploded, a transaction that worked perfectly for my plans. Master Jeremiah Whitmore had bought me cheap, thinking he was getting a bargain on a well-trained house slave. He had no idea he was purchasing his own destruction. The Whitmores were different from the Beauregards. Where the Beauregards had been cruel through passion and impulse, the Whitmores were cruel through calculation. They measured out suffering like ingredients in a recipe, always ensuring maximum pain with minimum cost to themselves. Master Jeremiah kept meticulous records of every whipping, every missed meal, every punishment, as if cruelty were just another crop to be harvested. His wife, Mrs. Margaret, was worse. She had a talent for psychological torture that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. She'd give slave children toys, let them play for a few days, then burn the toys in front of them as punishment for imaginary infractions. She'd promise freedom to elderly slaves who could no longer work, then sell them downriver at the last moment. Her cruelty had an artistic quality that made my skin crawl. Their 3 sons, Jeremiah Jr., Deet Marcus and David, were being groomed to continue the family tradition. At 19, 17, and 15, respectively, they already showed their parents' casual disregard for human suffering. They competed with each other to see who could devise the most creative punishments for slaves who displeased them. But every family has its fractures, and the Whitmores were no exception. I spent my first month there mapping their weaknesses, like a general studying enemy fortifications. Jeremiah Jr. was the obvious heir, but he was also weak-willed and easily manipulated. He desperately wanted his father's approval, but lacked the stomach for the family's more brutal traditions. I'd seen him vomit after witnessing a particularly savage beating, though he tried to hide it from his brothers. Marcus was the opposite, too eager for violence, too quick to anger. His father worried that Marcus's excesses would draw unwanted attention from abolitionists or federal authorities. There were already whispers in town about Marcus's treatment of female slaves. David, the youngest, was the most dangerous because he was the smartest. He watched everything with calculating eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of my own. If I wasn't careful, he might see through my plans before I could execute them. The key to destroying the Whitmores lay in their obsession with maintaining their reputation. They were old Louisiana aristocracy, descended from French colonists who'd built their fortune on sugar and slaves. Their social standing was everything to them, more important than money, more important than family bonds, more important than life itself. I began my campaign on a Sunday morning after church. The family had returned from services in town, where Reverend Morrison had delivered a particularly fire and brimstone sermon about the sins of pride and greed. The irony wasn't lost on me as I served them their dinner, invisible as always, listening to them gossip about their neighbors' moral failings. "Did you see how Martha Caldwell was dressed today?" Mrs. Margaret said, cutting her ham with surgical precision. "That dress must have cost more than most people make in a year. Shameful display of vanity." "The Caldwells have always been nouveau riche," Master Jeremiah replied. "No breeding, no class. Money can't buy respectability." Aye, this was my opening. I waited until I was alone with Jeremiah Jr. in the library, where he was pretending to read a book on plantation management while actually staring out the window at the slave quarters. "Master Jeremiah," I said quietly, approaching with a silver tray of brandy, "might I ask you something, sir?" He looked surprised. Slaves weren't supposed to initiate conversations with family members. "What is it?" "Well, sir, I was in town yesterday running errands for your mother, and I heard some folks talking about your family. I probably shouldn't repeat it, but—" "Tell me what you heard," he said, his voice sharp with sudden attention. "They were saying how impressed they were with Master Marcus's enthusiasm for discipline, said he was really carrying on the family tradition." I paused, letting the words sink in. "But then someone else said maybe he was carrying it too far, said there might be consequences if certain people in Baton Rouge heard about it." The color drained from Jeremiah Jr.'s face. He knew exactly what I was talking about. There'd been rumors for months about federal investigators looking into plantation conditions, sparked by abolitionist reports from up north. "Who was saying this?" he demanded. "I'm not sure I should say, Master Jeremiah. I don't want to cause trouble between families. Tell me." "It was Judge Harrison's son, sir. And that lawyer, Mr. Pemberton, they seemed real concerned about what might happen if the wrong people started asking questions." This was a masterful lie because it contained elements that Jeremiah Jr. could verify. Judge Harrison was indeed concerned about federal oversight, and Lawyer Pemberton had been advising plantation owners to moderate their practices. By suggesting they were specifically discussing the Whitmores, I planted a seed of paranoia that would grow into something much larger. That evening, Jeremiah Jr. confronted Marcus about his excessive treatment of slaves. Marcus, predictably, exploded in anger, accusing his older brother of being weak and unfit to inherit the plantation. The argument escalated until their father intervened, demanding to know what had caused the fight. When Jeremiah Jr. explained about the rumors in town, Master Jeremiah's face went white with rage. The family's reputation was being discussed, criticized by their social equals. This was unthinkable. "From now on," he announced, "there will be no punishments without my direct approval. We cannot afford to have our family name associated with irregularities." Marcus was furious at being reined in, but it was David's reaction that interested me most. He watched the entire confrontation with those calculating eyes, and I could see him trying to piece together how this family crisis had started. He was dangerous, but he was also 15 years old and convinced of his own superiority. That combination of intelligence and arrogance would be his downfall. Over the following weeks, I carefully fed information to each brother about the others. I told Jeremiah Jr. that Marcus was planning to undermine him with their father. I told Marcus that Jeremiah Jr. was spreading rumors about Marcus's instability to family friends. I told David that both his older brothers were trying to cut him out of the inheritance entirely. Each piece of information was carefully crafted to be believable and inflammatory. I never told outright lies. Instead, I took real tensions and amplified them, real fears and gave them shape, real suspicions and provided them with apparent confirmation. The family began to fracture along predictable lines. Meals became tense affairs, where every comment was analyzed for hidden meaning. Business decisions were questioned and second-guessed. Trust evaporated like morning dew under the Louisiana sun. But I wasn't finished with them yet. The Whitmores had killed my mother through overwork and neglect, and simple family discord wasn't sufficient payment for that debt. They needed to lose everything, their reputation, their wealth, their future, their hope. As I lay in my quarters that night, listening to another heated argument from the big house, I began planning the next phase of their destruction. The Whitmores thought they were masters of cruelty, but they were about to learn what real cruelty looked like. And I was just getting started. The Caldwell plantation sprawled across the richest bottomland in the parish, its fields stretching to the horizon like a green ocean of cotton and sugarcane. Master Edmund Caldwell had built his fortune through shrewd investments and ruthless efficiency, transforming a modest inheritance into one of Louisiana's most profitable operations. He was proud of his success, proud of his modern methods, proud of his reputation as a progressive plantation owner who treated his slaves humanely. That pride would be his undoing. I'd been sold to the Caldwells after the Whitmore family's spectacular collapse, a collapse that had taken exactly 4 months to complete. The brothers had destroyed each other so thoroughly that Master Jeremiah had been forced to sell the plantation to pay their debts. Marcus had fled to Texas after a scandal involving a judge's daughter. David had been sent to military school in Virginia. Jeremiah Jr. had suffered what the doctors called a nervous breakdown and was confined to an asylum in New Orleans. The Caldwells bought me as part of a lot of household slaves, never suspecting that their new acquisition had orchestrated their neighbor's destruction. Master Edmund prided himself on his ability to judge character, but he saw only what I wanted him to see. A quiet, efficient, unremarkable boy who performed his duties without complaint. The Caldwell family was different from the others I'd destroyed. They weren't obviously cruel or dramatically dysfunctional. Master Edmund was stern but not sadistic. Mrs. Eleanor was cold but not actively malicious. Their twin daughters, Charlotte and Caroline, were spoiled but not evil. Their son Robert was arrogant but not vicious. This apparent normalcy made them more dangerous in some ways, but also more vulnerable. The Caldwells' weakness wasn't cruelty or family discord. It was their absolute dependence on their reputation for efficiency and innovation. Master Edmund had built his fortune by convincing investors and creditors that his plantation was the future of Southern agriculture. Any threat to that reputation would bring their entire financial structure crashing down. I spent my first 2 months at Caldwell Plantation, learning their routines, studying their business practices, and identifying the pressure points that would cause maximum damage. Master Edmund kept meticulous records of everything: crop yields, slave productivity, equipment maintenance, financial transactions. His office was a shrine to organization and control, with ledgers and charts covering every surface. But organization can become a weakness when it's too rigid, and control can become vulnerability when it depends on too many moving parts. The Caldwells had built a machine of impressive complexity, but machines can be sabotaged by someone who understands how they work. My opportunity came during the harvest season, when the plantation was operating at maximum capacity. Master Edmund had invested heavily in new equipment, steam-powered cotton gins, improved plows, a revolutionary new sugar mill that was supposed to increase processing efficiency by 30%. He'd borrowed substantial sums to finance these improvements, confident that increased productivity would quickly pay for the investments. The harvest was crucial. A successful season would establish the Caldwells as the most innovative planters in Louisiana. A failed harvest would bankrupt them. I began with small sabotages that appeared to be accidents or equipment failures. A crucial gear in the cotton gin developed mysterious stress fractures. The new plows kept breaking down due to manufacturing defects. The sugar mill's boiler developed leaks that required constant repairs. Each failure was carefully designed to look like normal wear and tear or poor craftsmanship. I'd learned enough about machinery during my years of observation to know exactly where to apply pressure to cause maximum damage with minimum evidence. A tiny file mark in the right place could weaken a gear until it shattered under normal use. A small puncture in a boiler pipe could create a leak that would worsen gradually over time. Master Edmund was frustrated but not yet suspicious. He blamed the equipment manufacturers and demanded replacements or repairs. But the delays were mounting, and the harvest season was short. Every day of lost productivity meant thousands of dollars in reduced profits. While the mechanical sabotages continued, I began the second phase of my plan, undermining the Caldwells' relationships with their business partners. Master Edmund's success depended on a network of creditors, investors, and buyers who trusted his judgment and reliability. That trust was built on years of consistent performance, but it was also fragile. I started by intercepting and altering correspondence. Master Edmund conducted much of his business through letters, and as a house slave, I had access to his office when he was away. I became expert at steaming open envelopes, making subtle changes to documents, and resealing them so perfectly that no one could detect the tampering. A letter confirming a cotton shipment became a letter requesting a delay. A payment schedule was altered to show different dates. An order for equipment parts was changed to specify the wrong components. Each alteration was small enough to seem like a clerical error, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Business partners began to question the Caldwells' reliability. Shipments arrived late or contained the wrong products. Payments were missed or sent to the wrong accounts. Equipment orders were delayed because the wrong parts had been requested. Master Edmund was bewildered by the sudden rash of mistakes and misunderstandings. He prided himself on his attention to detail, and these errors were completely out of character. He began double-checking everything, which only slowed operations further and increased his stress. The third phase of my plan targeted the plantation's workforce. The Caldwells employed both slaves and free workers, Irish immigrants, poor whites, and skilled craftsmen who maintained the complex machinery. These groups had little love for each other, but they'd learned to work together under Master Edmund's firm management. I began spreading rumors designed to inflame existing tensions. I told the Irish workers that Master Edmund was planning to replace them with cheaper slave labor. I told the skilled craftsmen that their jobs were being given to unqualified immigrants. I told the slaves that the free workers were being paid bonuses that came from reduced food rations for the slave quarters. Each rumor contained just enough truth to be believable. Master Edmund was indeed always looking for ways to reduce labor costs, and there had been discussions about training slaves to perform more skilled tasks. The workers' existing prejudices and fears made them eager to believe the worst about each other. Productivity plummeted as the different groups began sabotaging each other's work. Tools disappeared, equipment was damaged, fights broke out over imaginary slights. Master Edmund found himself spending more time mediating disputes than managing the harvest. By November, the Caldwell plantation was in chaos. The harvest was weeks behind schedule, equipment failures had cost thousands of dollars, business relationships were strained to the breaking point, and the workforce was on the verge of open rebellion. Master Edmund's creditors began demanding explanations for the delays and cost overruns. His investors questioned whether their money was being managed properly. His buyers started looking for more reliable suppliers. The final blow came when I arranged for a fire in the main cotton warehouse. It wasn't a large fire. I was careful to ensure that no one was hurt, but it destroyed several thousand bales of processed cotton that were waiting for shipment. The loss was catastrophic, both financially and symbolically. The fire was the last straw for Master Edmund's creditors. They called in their loans, demanding immediate payment. The Caldwells couldn't meet their obligations without the income from the destroyed cotton, and they had no choice but to declare bankruptcy. Within 6 months, the plantation was sold at auction. The Caldwell family lost everything: their home, their business, their social standing, their future. Master Edmund suffered a stroke brought on by stress and financial ruin. Mrs. Eleanor and the children were forced to move in with relatives in Mobile, where they lived as poor relations dependent on charity. I watched their final departure from the slave quarters, feeling that familiar cold satisfaction. The Caldwells had profited from human misery for decades, hiding their cruelty behind a facade of efficiency and progress. They'd treated slaves like machinery, valuable property to be maintained and optimized, but never recognized as human beings with feelings and rights. Now they knew what it felt like to lose everything, to have their lives destroyed by forces beyond their control. It was a lesson they'd never forget, assuming they survived long enough to learn from it. As the auction ended and new owners took possession of the plantation, I prepared for my next assignment. The Henderson family owned the largest sugar operation in the parish, and they had a particular reputation for cruelty toward female slaves. They would require special attention. But that night, as I lay in my quarters listening to the sounds of the plantation under new management, I allowed myself a moment of grim satisfaction. 3 families down, 2 to go. Each destruction had been more sophisticated than the last, each plan more perfectly executed. I was getting better at this. The Henderson sugar plantation rose from the bayou like a monument to human greed, its massive brick smokestacks belching black smoke into the Louisiana sky day and night. Master Cornelius Henderson had built his empire on sugar and suffering, creating one of the most profitable operations in the South through methods that made other planters uncomfortable. Even in a society built on slavery, the Hendersons had a reputation for exceptional cruelty. I'd been purchased by Master Cornelius after the Caldwell auction, selected specifically for my apparent docility and proven reliability as a house slave. He had no idea that his new acquisition had systematically destroyed 3 of the most powerful families in the parish. To him, I was just another piece of property, valuable but ultimately replaceable. The Henderson family was different from my previous targets. Where the others had hidden their cruelty behind facades of respectability, the Hendersons were openly brutal. They didn't care what their neighbors thought because their wealth made them untouchable. Master Cornelius owned judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials throughout the region. His money bought him immunity from consequences. But money couldn't protect him from what I had planned. The Henderson household consisted of Master Cornelius, his wife Vivian, and their adult children: Theodore, the heir apparent; Beatrice, a spinster daughter who managed the household with iron discipline; and Jonathan, the youngest son who'd recently returned from university in Charleston with radical ideas about plantation management. Each family member had their own particular cruelties. Master Cornelius preferred psychological torture. He'd promise slaves their freedom, then sell them downriver at the last moment. Mrs. Vivian had a talent for physical punishment that bordered on artistry. She could inflict maximum pain while leaving minimal visible marks. Theodore was a sadist who used his authority to abuse female slaves with impunity. Beatrice was perhaps the worst. She'd befriend slave children, gain their trust, then betray them in the most devastating ways possible. Jonathan was different. His university education had exposed him to abolitionist ideas, and he'd returned home with uncomfortable questions about the family business. He wasn't actively cruel like the others, but his moral cowardice made him complicit in their crimes. He knew what his family was doing was wrong, but he lacked the courage to oppose them. This internal conflict made Jonathan my entry point into the Henderson family's destruction. I began by positioning myself as Jonathan's personal servant, a role that gave me access to his private thoughts and conversations. He was struggling with his conscience, torn between his family's expectations and his growing belief that slavery was morally indefensible. He'd started drinking heavily to numb his guilt, and alcohol made him talkative. During our private moments, when I was helping him dress or serving his meals, I began planting seeds of doubt about his family's methods. I never directly criticized the Hendersons. Instead, I asked innocent questions that forced Jonathan to confront uncomfortable truths. "Master Jonathan," I said one evening as I helped him prepare for bed, "might I ask you something about that book you were reading?" He looked up from his brandy, eyes already glazed with alcohol. "What about it?" "Well, sir, it talked about natural rights and human dignity. I was wondering, do you think those ideas apply to everyone or just to certain people?" The question hit him like a physical blow. I could see him struggling with the implications, trying to reconcile his education with his upbringing. That's a complex philosophical question, Isaac. Not something a slave would typically understand. Yes, sir. I just wondered because some of the things that happen here, they seem like they might conflict with those ideas you were reading about. I left the statement hanging in the air, watching as Jonathan's guilt and alcohol combined to create a perfect storm of self-doubt. Over the following weeks, I continued this subtle psychological campaign, always careful to appear naive and curious rather than accusatory. The strategy worked perfectly. Jonathan began questioning everything about his family's operations. He started investigating the plantation's records, trying to understand the full scope of their cruelties. What he discovered horrified him. Detailed accounts of punishments, sales of slave families, and systematic abuse that went far beyond anything he'd imagined. But Jonathan's growing moral crisis was only the first phase of my plan. The real destruction would come from exposing the Henderson family's secrets to the outside world. Master Cornelius had built his empire through a combination of legitimate business and criminal activity. He smuggled slaves from Africa long after the international trade was banned, sold free blacks into slavery through forged documents, and used his political connections to eliminate business competitors through legal harassment. His wealth was built on a foundation of crimes that would destroy him if they ever came to light. I'd learned about these activities through careful observation and document theft. As a house slave, I had access to Master Cornelius's private office, where he kept records of his illegal operations. He was too arrogant to believe that a slave could read well enough to understand the documents, so he never bothered to secure them properly. Over several months, I carefully copied the most damaging records, using my access to the office to trace letters and documents when no one was watching. I learned about bribes paid to customs officials, forged papers used to enslave free blacks, and murders committed to silence potential witnesses. The Henderson family wasn't just cruel, they were criminals on a massive scale. The challenge was finding a way to expose these crimes without revealing my own role in the discovery. I needed someone with the authority and motivation to investigate the Hendersons, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The answer came from an unexpected source, the federal government. President Tyler's administration was under pressure from abolitionists to enforce existing laws against the international slave trade. Federal investigators were quietly gathering evidence against smuggling operations throughout the South, but they needed inside information to build their cases. I began leaving anonymous letters at the post office in town, always careful to vary my handwriting and used different types of paper. The letters contained specific details about Henderson's smuggling operations, ship names, arrival dates, cargo manifests, and payment records. I never provided enough information in a single letter to seem suspicious, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Federal investigators began watching the Henderson operations, and what they saw confirmed the anonymous tips. Ships arrived at night carrying illegal cargo. Bribes were paid to local officials. Free blacks disappeared and reappeared as slaves on Henderson plantations. While the federal investigation gathered momentum, I worked on destroying the family from within. Jonathan's guilt had reached a breaking point, and he was drinking himself into oblivion every night. I began suggesting that he might find peace by confessing his family's crimes to the authorities. "Master Jonathan," I said one night as he sat in his study, staring at a bottle of whiskey, "you seem troubled by something." "Troubled?" He laughed bitterly. "That's an understatement, Isaac. I'm living in hell. Perhaps talking to someone might help, sir. A minister, or maybe someone in authority who could provide guidance. No one would understand. No one would believe the things my family has done. Begging your pardon, sir, but there are people whose job it is to investigate such things. Federal marshals, judges who aren't beholden to local interests. Sometimes the truth has a way of setting people free." The seed was planted. Over the following weeks, Jonathan's drinking worsened, and his guilt became unbearable. He began making cryptic comments about doing the right thing and making amends for past sins. The crisis came to a head when federal marshals arrived at the plantation with search warrants. They'd gathered enough evidence to justify a full investigation, and they were looking for the documents I'd been copying for months. Jonathan saw the marshals as a sign from God. In his drunken, guilt-ridden state, he confessed everything. Not just his family's crimes, but his own complicity in their operations. He provided the investigators with access to records they never could have obtained legally, sealing his family's fate. The Henderson Empire collapsed within weeks. Master Cornelius was arrested on federal charges of slave smuggling and murder. Theodore fled to Mexico but was captured and extradited. Beatrice and Mrs. Vivian were charged as accessories to various crimes. The plantation was seized by federal authorities and sold to pay restitution to the families of their victims. Jonathan was granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation, but the guilt destroyed him anyway. He spent his remaining years in an asylum, raving about the sins of his family and the judgment of God. As I watched the Henderson family led away in chains, I felt that familiar cold satisfaction. They'd built their fortune on the suffering of others, believing their wealth made them untouchable. They'd learned that no one is beyond the reach of justice. It just sometimes takes a while to arrive. But I wasn't finished yet. 2 families remained, and they would be the most challenging targets yet. The Morrison family owned the largest cotton operation in the parish, and they had connections that reached all the way to Washington. The final family, the Blackwoods, were old Louisiana aristocracy with roots going back to the colonial period. Both families would require everything I'd learned from my previous campaigns, but I was ready for them. Each destruction had taught me new techniques, new ways to exploit human weakness and turn strength into vulnerability. As I prepared for my next assignment, I reflected on how far I'd come from that 7-year-old boy watching Samuel's beating. I'd transformed myself into something the white folks had never imagined possible, a slave who could think, plan, and execute complex strategies that brought down the most powerful families in Louisiana. They'd created me through their cruelty, and now I was their judgment. The irony was perfect, and the justice was absolute. 2 more families to go. The Morrison cotton plantations stretched across 10,000 acres of the richest soil in Louisiana, its endless white fields resembling snow-covered hills under the autumn sun. Master Augustus Morrison had inherited this empire from his father and grandfather, building upon their legacy to create what many considered the most successful cotton operation in the entire South. His wealth was legendary, his political connections reached into the highest levels of government, and his social influence extended far beyond the borders of Louisiana. He would be my most challenging target yet. I'd been sold to the Morrisons after the Henderson family's spectacular downfall, purchased as part of a lot of household slaves from the federal auction. Master Augustus prided himself on his ability to acquire quality property at bargain prices, and he saw my purchase as another shrewd business decision. He had no idea he'd just bought his own destruction. The Morrison family was different from all my previous targets. They weren't obviously cruel like the Hendersons, or dysfunctional like the Whitmores, or vulnerable like the Caldwells. They were competent, unified, and powerful. Master Augustus was a brilliant businessman who'd survived economic panics that destroyed lesser planters. His wife, Constance, was a shrewd political operator who managed their social connections with surgical precision. Their children, Augustus Jr., Margaret and young William, were being groomed to continue the family dynasty. But every fortress has its weaknesses, and I'd learned to find them. The Morrisons' strength lay in their reputation for stability and reliability. They were the family other planters turned to for leadership during crises. Their word was their bond, their judgment was trusted implicitly, and their success was seen as proof that the Southern way of life was sustainable and just. That reputation was also their greatest vulnerability. I spent my first 3 months at Morrison Plantation studying their operations with the intensity of a military strategist planning a siege. The plantation was a marvel of organization and efficiency, with detailed systems for everything from crop rotation to slave management. Master Augustus had created a machine that ran so smoothly it seemed almost automatic. But machines are only as reliable as their weakest components, and even the best systems can be sabotaged by someone who understands how they work. My opportunity came during the cotton harvest, the most critical time of year for any plantation. The Morrisons had invested heavily in expanding their operations, borrowing substantial sums to purchase additional land and equipment. A successful harvest would cement their position as the premier cotton producers in Louisiana. A failed harvest would create financial pressures that could destabilize their entire empire. I began with what appeared to be a series of unfortunate accidents. The first incident occurred in the main cotton gin, where a crucial drive belt snapped during peak processing time. The break appeared to be caused by normal wear and tear, but I'd carefully weakened the belt over several weeks, using a technique I'd perfected during my time with the Caldwells. The repair required shutting down operations for 3 days while replacement parts were shipped from New Orleans. The second incident was a fire in one of the storage warehouses. I was careful to ensure the fire started in a way that looked accidental, a lantern knocked over by a careless worker. But the timing was devastating. The warehouse contained nearly 1,000 bales of processed cotton ready for shipment, representing weeks of work and thousands of dollars in value. The third incident was the most subtle: contamination of the cotton crop by a plant disease that I'd carefully introduced using infected seeds obtained from a failed plantation upriver. The disease spread slowly through the fields, reducing the quality of the cotton and making it unsuitable for premium markets. Each incident by itself was unfortunate, but manageable. Together, they created a pattern of problems that began to undermine confidence in Morrison operations. Buyers started questioning the reliability of Morrison cotton. Creditors began asking uncomfortable questions about the plantation's ability to meet its obligations. Master Augustus was frustrated, but not yet suspicious. He attributed the problems to bad luck and increased his efforts to maintain quality and efficiency. But the stress was beginning to show, and stress makes people vulnerable to manipulation. While the operational sabotages continued, I began the second phase of my plan. undermining the Morrison family's political and social connections. Master Augustus's influence depended on a network of relationships built over decades, but those relationships were based on mutual benefit and shared interests. If the Morrisons appeared to be losing their power or reliability, their allies would quickly distance themselves. I started by intercepting and altering correspondence between Master Augustus and his political contacts. As his personal valet, I had access to his private study where he conducted much of his business. I became expert at steaming open letters, making subtle changes to their contents, and resealing them perfectly. A letter supporting a particular candidate became a letter opposing him. A promise of financial support was changed to a request for a loan. A social invitation was altered to suggest a different date or location. Each change was small enough to seem like a clerical error, but the cumulative effect was devastating. Political allies began to question Master Augustus's reliability. Social connections were strained by apparent snubs and misunderstandings. Business partners wondered if the Morrisons were facing financial difficulties that affected their judgment. The third phase of my plan targeted the Morrison family's unity, which was their greatest source of strength. Unlike my previous targets, the Morrisons genuinely cared about each other and worked together effectively. Breaking that unity would require more sophisticated psychological manipulation than I'd used before. I began by exploiting the natural tensions that exist in any family business. Augustus Jr. was eager to prove himself worthy of inheriting the plantation, but his father was reluctant to give up control. Margaret was intelligent and capable, but frustrated by the limitations placed on women in plantation society. Young William was rebellious and questioning, influenced by new ideas he'd encountered at university. I started planting seeds of doubt about each family member's loyalty and competence. I told Augustus Jr. that his father was considering leaving the plantation to Margaret because he doubted his son's business judgment. I told Margaret that her brothers were planning to exclude her from any inheritance because they saw her as a threat to their authority. I told William that his family was planning to force him into a marriage he didn't want to secure a business alliance. Each piece of information was carefully crafted to exploit existing fears and resentments. I never told outright lies. Instead, I took real concerns and gave them apparent confirmation through selective quotations and misrepresented conversations. The Morrison family began to fracture along predictable lines. Business meetings became tense affairs, where every decision was questioned and second-guessed. Family dinners turned into subtle battlegrounds, where each member tried to advance their own interests while undermining their relatives. But the Morrisons were stronger than my previous targets, and they began to recognize that something was wrong. Master Augustus started investigating the pattern of problems plaguing his plantation, looking for connections between the various incidents. Margaret began questioning the sources of information that had caused family tensions. Augustus Jr. started double-checking business correspondence to ensure accuracy. I realized I needed to accelerate my timeline before they discovered my role in their troubles. The final phase of my plan was the most dangerous, a direct assault on the Morrison family's financial foundation. Master Augustus had built his empire through careful management and conservative investments, but he'd also taken on substantial debt to finance his recent expansion. If I could create a cash flow crisis at the right moment, the entire structure would collapse. I arranged for a series of coordinated disasters that would strain the Morrison finances beyond their breaking point. A shipment of cotton was accidentally contaminated with river water during transport, making it worthless. A major buyer cancelled a large order due to quality concerns that I'd carefully orchestrated. A bank loan came due early due to a clerical error in the paperwork that I'd arranged through my network of contacts in New Orleans. The Morrison empire began to crumble under the financial pressure. Creditors demanded immediate payment. Buyers looked for more reliable suppliers. political allies distanced themselves from a family that appeared to be losing its power and influence. Master Augustus fought desperately to save his plantation, but the problems were coming too fast and from too many directions. He was forced to sell land to raise cash, which only accelerated the decline by reducing the plantation's productive capacity. The end came during a family meeting where the Morrisons tried to decide how to respond to their mounting crises. The stress and mutual suspicion I'd carefully cultivated finally exploded into open conflict. Augustus Jr. accused his father of mismanaging the plantation. Margaret blamed her brothers for excluding her from important decisions. William announced his intention to leave Louisiana entirely and pursue a different life in the North. The family that had been their greatest strength became their greatest weakness as they turned on each other in their desperation and fear. Within 6 months, the Morrison plantation was sold at auction to pay creditors. The family scattered, Augustus Jr. to Texas, Margaret to relatives in Charleston, William to New York, where he became an abolitionist speaker. Master Augustus and his wife retired to a small house in New Orleans, living on the charity of former friends who pitied their fall from grace. As I watched the auction proceedings from the slave quarters, I felt that familiar cold satisfaction. The Morrisons had been the most challenging target yet, but their destruction was also the most complete. They'd lost everything, their wealth, their influence, their unity, their future. But I wasn't finished yet. One family remained, the Blackwoods, the oldest and most powerful plantation dynasty in Louisiana. They would be my final target and my greatest challenge. As I prepared for my last campaign, I reflected on how much I'd learned and how far I'd come. Each family had taught me new techniques, new ways to exploit human weakness and turn strength into vulnerability. The Blackwoods would face the full weight of everything I'd learned from destroying their neighbors. They had no idea what was coming for them. The Blackwood plantation rose from the Louisiana landscape like a monument to old-world aristocracy. Its massive Greek Revival mansion, surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The family had ruled this land for over a century, their roots reaching back to the earliest French colonial settlements. They were Louisiana royalty, their bloodline intertwined with the very history of the South itself. They would be my masterpiece. I'd been purchased by Master Reginald Blackwood after the Morrison auction, selected specifically for my reputation as an exceptional house slave. The irony wasn't lost on me. My very success at destroying families had enhanced my value as property. Master Reginald paid top dollar for my services, believing he was acquiring a prize that would enhance his household's efficiency. He had no idea he'd just purchased the architect of his family's doom. The Blackwoods were different from all my previous targets. They weren't merely wealthy or powerful. They were an institution. Their influence extended far beyond Louisiana, reaching into the halls of Congress, the boardrooms of northern banks, and the drawing rooms of European nobility. They'd survived wars, economic panics, and social upheavals that had destroyed lesser families. They seemed untouchable, eternal, inevitable. But I'd learned that no family is truly invulnerable. Every dynasty has its weaknesses. Every empire has its fault lines. The key is finding the right pressure point and applying force with surgical precision. The Blackwood family consisted of Master Reginald, the current patriarch, his wife Evangeline, a former Charleston belle who'd brought substantial wealth to the marriage, and their only child, Nathaniel, the heir apparent who would inherit one of the largest fortunes in the South. This was both their strength and their weakness. Unlike my previous targets, the Blackwoods had no internal conflicts to exploit. They were united in their purpose, aligned in their interests, and committed to preserving their legacy. But their entire future depended on a single person, Nathaniel. If something happened to the heir, the Blackwood dynasty would die with him. I spent my first months at the plantation studying Nathaniel with the intensity of a hunter tracking dangerous prey. He was 22 years old, educated at the finest schools in Europe, and groomed from birth to assume leadership of the family empire. He was intelligent, charismatic, and absolutely convinced of his own superiority and destiny. But Nathaniel had a weakness that his parents didn't know about. He was beginning to question everything he'd been taught about slavery and Southern society. His European education had exposed him to ideas that challenged the fundamental assumptions of plantation life. He'd read philosophers who argued for human equality, economists who questioned the efficiency of slave labor, and abolitionists who condemned the entire system as morally bankrupt. These ideas had planted seeds of doubt that were growing stronger every day. Nathaniel was struggling with the same crisis of conscience that had destroyed Jonathan Henderson, but he was hiding it more effectively. He went through the motions of being the perfect heir while privately questioning whether he wanted to inherit an empire built on human suffering. This internal conflict made him vulnerable to manipulation, but it also made him dangerous. If Nathaniel decided to reject his inheritance and become an abolitionist, he could do enormous damage to the Southern cause. His family name and social connections would give him credibility that ordinary abolitionists lacked. His insider knowledge of plantation operations would provide devastating ammunition for anti-slavery arguments. I realized that Nathaniel's moral crisis was the key to destroying the Blackwood family. But I needed to guide that crisis carefully, ensuring that it led to their destruction rather than their redemption. I began by positioning myself as Nathaniel's personal valet, a role that gave me intimate access to his private thoughts and struggles. He was drinking heavily to numb his guilt, and alcohol made him talkative about his doubts and fears. "Isaac," he said one night as I helped him prepare for bed, "do you ever think about freedom?" The question was dangerous territory, but I sensed an opportunity. "I think about many things, Master Nathaniel." "What kind of freedom do you mean?" "The freedom to choose your own path in life, to make decisions based on your own conscience rather than the expectations of others." "That sounds like a luxury that few people enjoy, sir. Most of us are bound by circumstances beyond our control." "But what if those circumstances are wrong? What if the entire system we're born into is fundamentally unjust?" I pretended to consider this carefully. "That's a heavy burden to carry, Master Nathaniel, questioning everything you've been taught, wondering if your whole life is built on a lie." "Exactly." He stared into his brandy glass as if it contained answers to his moral dilemma. "Sometimes I think it would be easier to just accept things as they are, to stop thinking and questioning and doubting." "Perhaps," I said quietly. "But once you start seeing the truth, it's hard to go back to believing comfortable lies." Over the following weeks, I carefully nurtured Nathaniel's moral crisis, always appearing to be the loyal servant while subtly encouraging his doubts about slavery and Southern society. I shared carefully selected stories about the cruelties I'd witnessed, always framing them as unfortunate exceptions rather than systemic problems. I asked innocent questions that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his family's wealth and power. But I was also planning something much more dramatic than simple moral persuasion. Nathaniel's crisis of conscience was just the first phase of my plan. The real destruction would come from exposing the Blackwood family's darkest secrets to the world. The Blackwoods had maintained their power for over a century through a combination of legitimate business and carefully hidden crimes. Like the Hendersons, they'd engaged in illegal slave smuggling, but their operations were far more sophisticated and extensive. They'd also been involved in political corruption, murder, and financial fraud on a scale that dwarfed anything I'd encountered before. Master Reginald kept records of these activities in a hidden safe behind a false wall in his study. He was too paranoid to trust banks or lawyers with evidence of his crimes, but too methodical to operate without detailed documentation. The safe contained enough evidence to destroy not just the Blackwood family, but dozens of other prominent families throughout the South. The challenge was gaining access to the safe without revealing my role in the theft. I needed someone with legitimate authority to discover the evidence, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated by Blackwood influence. The answer came from an unexpected source, Nathaniel himself. His moral crisis had reached a breaking point, and he was desperate to find some way to atone for his family's sins. He'd begun talking about confessing everything to federal authorities, but he didn't have access to the evidence that would make his confession credible. I began suggesting that the truth about his family's crimes might be hidden somewhere in the house, waiting to be discovered by someone with the courage to look for it. "Master Nathaniel," I said one evening as he sat in his study, staring at abolitionist pamphlets he'd hidden from his parents, "you seem troubled by the weight of secrets." "Secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch," he replied. "I sometimes wonder what other secrets this house contains, what other sins my family has committed in the name of preserving our legacy. Perhaps the truth is closer than you think, sir. Sometimes the evidence of wrongdoing is hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the moral courage to bring it to light." The seed was planted. Over the following days, Nathaniel began searching the house for evidence of his family's crimes. He was methodical and persistent, driven by a desperate need to understand the full scope of what he was inheriting. He found the hidden safe on a rainy Thursday evening in November. The combination was his grandfather's birthday, a detail I'd learned through careful observation of Master Reginald's habits. Nathaniel opened the safe and discovered a treasure trove of incriminating documents that detailed decades of criminal activity. The evidence was overwhelming: records of illegal slave shipments, bribes paid to federal officials, murders committed to silence witnesses, and financial fraud that had cheated investors out of millions of dollars. The Blackwood fortune wasn't just built on slavery, it was built on a foundation of crimes that reached into the highest levels of government and society. Nathaniel was horrified by what he discovered, but he was also relieved to finally understand the true nature of his inheritance. He spent the next week copying the most damaging documents, preparing to turn them over to federal authorities. But I wasn't finished with the Blackwood family yet. Nathaniel's confession would destroy their criminal empire. But I wanted something more personal, more devastating. I wanted them to experience the same helplessness and despair that they'd inflicted on thousands of slaves over the decades. The final phase of my plan was the most dangerous. I was going to destroy Nathaniel himself. Not physically, I wasn't a murderer, despite what my enemies might claim, but I was going to destroy his mind, his spirit, his ability to function as a human being. I was going to drive him insane with guilt and despair, leaving the Blackwood family with an heir who was alive but completely broken. I began by revealing to Nathaniel that I knew about his plans to confess to federal authorities. I told him that other slaves had overheard his conversations and were planning to inform Master Reginald about his betrayal. The threat of discovery sent Nathaniel into a panic, and his drinking increased dramatically. Then I began feeding him false information about the consequences of his planned confession. I told him that federal authorities were planning to arrest not just his parents, but every slave on the plantation as accomplices to the family's crimes. I suggested that his confession would result in the execution of innocent people who'd had no choice but to participate in Blackwood operations. The lies were carefully crafted to exploit Nathaniel's guilt and moral sensitivity. He was already struggling with the weight of his family's sins, and the possibility that his confession might harm innocent people pushed him over the edge into complete psychological collapse. Nathaniel began having nightmares, hallucinations, and periods of complete dissociation from reality. He would spend hours staring at nothing, muttering about blood and guilt and the judgment of God. His parents were bewildered by his sudden mental deterioration, calling in doctors who could find no physical cause for his condition. The confession never happened. Nathaniel was committed to a private asylum in New Orleans, where he spent his remaining years in a state of catatonic despair, occasionally emerging from his madness long enough to scream about the sins of his family before retreating back into silence. The Blackwood dynasty died with Nathaniel's sanity. Master Reginald and Evangeline were left without an heir, their carefully preserved bloodline ending in madness and shame. They tried to maintain their empire, but without a successor to carry on their legacy, their motivation crumbled. Business partners began to distance themselves from a family whose future was so uncertain. Political allies found new patrons whose influence seemed more reliable. Within 2 years, the Blackwood plantation was sold to pay debts that Master Reginald had stopped caring about managing. The family retreated to a modest house in New Orleans, where they lived as shadows of their former selves, visiting their broken son in the asylum and wondering how their perfect heir had become a drooling madman. The evidence of their crimes remained hidden in the safe, which was sold, along with the house, to new owners who never discovered its secrets. The Blackwood criminal empire died with their dynasty, its secrets buried with the family's power. As I watched the final auction of Blackwood property, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I'd experienced before. This hadn't been just another destruction. It had been a work of art, a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that had achieved perfect justice. The Blackwoods had believed themselves untouchable, eternal, inevitable. They'd ruled Louisiana like feudal lords, treating human beings as property and building their legacy on a foundation of suffering. Now they knew what it felt like to lose everything: their power, their wealth, their future, their hope. But more than that, they'd lost their heir to the same kind of madness they'd inflicted on their victims. Nathaniel's broken mind was a mirror reflecting the spiritual corruption of his entire family. They'd created a monster in their own image, and that monster had destroyed them from within. 5 families, 5 dynasties, 5 empires built on human suffering, all brought to ruin by a 14-year-old slave boy who'd learned to turn their own weapons against them. I was ready for my final chapter. The Louisiana bayou stretched endlessly before me, its dark waters reflecting a sky heavy with storm clouds. Spanish moss hung from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of decay and rebirth. This was where I would disappear, where Isaac the slave would die and something else would be born from the ashes of 5 destroyed dynasties. It had been 6 months since the final Blackwood auction, 6 months since I'd completed my campaign of vengeance against the families who'd shaped my childhood through their cruelty. The plantation system that had seemed so permanent, so inevitable, was crumbling throughout Louisiana. 5 of the most powerful families in the state had fallen within 3 years, their destruction sending shockwaves through Southern society that reached all the way to Washington. Newspapers called it an unprecedented economic catastrophe. Politicians blamed northern agitators and federal interference. Plantation owners whispered about curses and divine judgment. But none of them suspected the truth, that their entire world had been brought down by a slave boy who'd learned to think, plan, and execute strategies more sophisticated than anything their military academies could teach. I'd been sold one final time after the Blackwood collapse, purchased by a small farmer named Jenkins who needed help with his modest cotton operation. Jenkins was different from my previous owners. He wasn't wealthy enough to be truly cruel, and he was too practical to waste energy on unnecessary brutality. He treated his slaves like valuable livestock, well-fed, adequately housed, and worked hard, but not to death. Under different circumstances, I might have found Jenkins tolerable, but I was no longer capable of accepting any form of bondage, no matter how benign. The boy who'd watched Samuel's beating was gone, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. I'd tasted power, the power to destroy those who thought themselves untouchable, and I couldn't go back to being property. So I began planning my escape. The bayou was perfect for my purposes. Its maze of waterways and islands provided countless hiding places, and its reputation for danger kept most people away. Runaway slaves who entered the swamp were usually assumed dead within days, killed by alligators, snakes, or the treacherous terrain itself. But I'd spent years studying maps and talking to other slaves who'd attempted escapes. I knew which routes were safest, which seasons offered the best conditions, and which supplies were essential for survival. More importantly, I'd learned patience. I could wait for the perfect opportunity rather than rushing into a desperate flight that would end in capture or death. The opportunity came during harvest season, when Jenkins was focused on bringing in his crop and had less time to monitor his slaves closely. I'd been preparing for months, secretly gathering supplies and hiding them in various locations throughout the plantation. Food, tools, weapons, medicine, everything I'd need for an extended journey through hostile territory. On a moonless night in October, I simply walked away. I didn't run or sneak or try to cover my tracks. I walked calmly to the edge of the plantation, retrieved my hidden supplies, and disappeared into the swamp like a ghost, returning to its natural element. By the time Jenkins discovered my absence the next morning, I was already miles away, following waterways that would make tracking impossible. The first weeks in the bayou were the hardest. Despite my preparation, the reality of survival in the wilderness was more challenging than I'd anticipated. The water was treacherous, filled with hidden obstacles that could capsize a boat or trap an unwary traveler. The wildlife was genuinely dangerous. Alligators, water moccasins, and other predators that saw humans as potential prey. The weather was unpredictable, with sudden storms that could turn calm waterways into raging torrents. But I adapted. I'd learned to be patient, observant, and ruthless when necessary. I studied the patterns of the swamp, learning which areas were safe and which were deadly. I developed techniques for moving silently through the water, for finding food and shelter, for avoiding the search parties that occasionally ventured into the bayou looking for runaway slaves. Most importantly, I learned to be alone with my thoughts. For the first time since childhood, I had time to reflect on what I'd done and what I'd become. 5 families destroyed, dozens of lives ruined, an entire social system destabilized by my actions. The scale of my revenge was staggering, even to me. I felt no guilt about the destruction I'd caused. The families I'd targeted had built their wealth and power through the systematic brutalization of human beings. They treated slaves like animals, separating families, working people to death, and inflicting cruelties that would have shocked medieval torturers. They deserved everything that happened to them and more. But I also recognized that my campaign of vengeance had changed me in fundamental ways. The cold calculation required to destroy 5 families had frozen something essential in my soul. I could no longer feel joy, love, or hope, only the grim satisfaction of justice served and enemies defeated. I'd become exactly what they'd tried to make me, a weapon. But instead of being their weapon, I'd become their judgment. As months passed in the bayou, I began to understand that my story was becoming something larger than personal revenge. Word of the family destructions had spread throughout the South, carried by newspapers, letters, and the gossip networks that connected plantations across the region. The scale and sophistication of the attacks had captured the imagination of both slaves and masters, creating a legend that grew with each retelling. Slaves whispered about a mysterious figure who could bring down the most powerful families in Louisiana. They called me the Shadow, the Ghost, the Judgment. Some said I was a runaway slave with supernatural powers. Others claimed I was a northern agent sent to destroy the plantation system from within. A few believed I was the spirit of every slave who died under the whip, returned to exact vengeance on their oppressors. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. I was just a boy who'd learned to think strategically and act ruthlessly. But the legend was more powerful than the truth, and legends have a way of taking on lives of their own. Plantation owners throughout the South began looking over their shoulders, wondering if they might be next. They increased security, investigated their slaves more carefully, and tried to identify potential threats before they could develop into something dangerous. The paranoia was delicious. They were finally experiencing the fear that slaves lived with every day. But I knew my active campaign was over. The 5 families I'd targeted had been chosen for specific reasons. They'd all played roles in shaping my childhood trauma, and their destruction had been deeply personal. I had no desire to become a professional revolutionary or to spend my life hunting plantation owners. My revenge was complete, my justice served. Instead, I settled into a different kind of existence in the bayou. I built a hidden camp on a small island deep in the swamp, far from any traveled waterways. I learned to live off the land, hunting and fishing and gathering what I needed to survive. I created a life that was simple, solitary, and completely free. But I wasn't entirely isolated. Other runaway slaves occasionally found their way to my part of the bayou, and I began helping them when I could. I shared my knowledge of survival techniques, provided supplies and guidance, and helped them continue their journeys to freedom. I never told them who I was or what I'd done, but some seemed to sense that I was connected to the legends they'd heard. Word began to spread through the slave networks that there was someone in the bayou who could help runaways, someone who understood the systems of oppression and knew how to fight back. I became a station on an underground railroad that existed only in whispers and rumors, helping people escape to freedom while remaining hidden myself. Years passed. The Civil War came and went, bringing the end of slavery but not the end of injustice. Reconstruction promised equality but delivered new forms of oppression. The plantation system evolved into sharecropping and tenant farming, maintaining white supremacy through economic rather than legal means. I watched these changes from my hidden sanctuary, occasionally venturing into the world to gather information or help people in need. But I never stayed long in civilization. The bayou had become my true home, the only place where I felt completely free. As I grew older, I began to understand that my story had become part of Louisiana folklore. Parents told their children about the slave boy who'd brought down 5 families, though the details changed with each telling. Some versions made me a hero, others a monster, and a few suggested I'd never existed at all, that the family destructions had been coincidences or the work of multiple conspirators. I preferred the uncertainty. Legends are more powerful when they remain mysterious, when people can't be sure what's real and what's myth. The fear and respect my story inspired were more valuable than any recognition or fame I might have gained by revealing myself. Now, as I write these words in my hidden camp, I'm an old man whose hair has gone white and whose hands shake with age. The boy who watched Samuel's beating is long dead, replaced by someone harder and more dangerous than those plantation owners ever imagined possible. But I'm also free in a way that few people ever experience. I've lived my entire adult life on my own terms, beholden to no master, bound by no chains except those I choose to accept. I've seen justice served against those who thought themselves untouchable, and I've helped others find their own paths to freedom. The bayou keeps its secrets, and I've become one of them. When I die, my body will sink into these dark waters, and my story will become pure legend, told and retold, until no one remembers what was real and what was myth. But the fear will remain. Somewhere in the back of every oppressor's mind will be the knowledge that their victims might be watching, learning, planning. That cruelty creates its own enemies, and those enemies might be more dangerous than anyone imagines. That's my true legacy. Not the destruction of 5 families, but the understanding that no one is truly powerless. Even a slave boy, with nothing but his intelligence and determination, can bring down empires if he's willing to be patient, ruthless, and absolutely committed to justice. The silence of the bayou surrounds me now, broken only by the sounds of water and wind, and the creatures that call this wilderness home. It's a peaceful silence, the silence of someone who's completed his life's work and found his place in the world. I am Isaac, the boy who never blinked, the shadow who brought judgment to Louisiana's most powerful families. I am the ghost in the machine of oppression, the reminder that cruelty always creates its own enemies. And I am free. The bayou holds many secrets, but none darker than the truth of what I became in those final years. As my story spread through whispered legends across the South, I realized that my work had created something I never intended: hope. Slaves throughout Louisiana and beyond began to believe that resistance was possible, that the seemingly invincible plantation system could be challenged and defeated. They looked to the swamps where I was rumored to live, hoping for salvation, for leadership, for someone to show them the way to freedom. But I had nothing left to give them. The cold calculation that had allowed me to destroy 5 families had consumed everything human inside me. I could analyze their problems, devise strategies for their liberation, even help individuals escape to freedom. But I could no longer feel their pain as my own, could no longer connect with their hopes and dreams and fears. I had become a perfect weapon against oppression, but weapons don't love or hope or dream. They simply destroy what they're pointed at. In my final years, I began to understand the true cost of my revenge. I had achieved perfect justice against my enemies, but in doing so, I had sacrificed my own humanity. The boy who had once felt Samuel's pain as his own was gone, replaced by something that could calculate suffering like a mathematical equation, but could no longer truly feel it. Sometimes, in the deep silence of the bayou nights, I wondered if this was what the plantation owners had intended all along. Not to break my body or crush my spirit, but to transform me into something as cold and calculating as they were. Perhaps my revenge had been their final victory, turning their victim into a reflection of themselves. But then I would remember the faces of the slaves I had helped escape, the families reunited in freedom, the children who would grow up knowing that resistance was possible. My transformation had come at a terrible personal cost, but it had also created something valuable, proof that no system of oppression is truly invincible. The legend of Isaac would outlive the man, inspiring future generations to resist, to fight back, to never accept that their suffering was inevitable or just. In becoming a monster, I had also become a symbol of hope. And perhaps that was enough. As the morning mist rises from the dark waters of the bayou, I close this final chapter of my story. Somewhere in the distance, a nightbird calls to its mate, and the sound echoes across the water like a prayer or a promise. The silence returns, deeper than before, carrying with it the weight of 5 destroyed dynasties and 1 transformed soul. In that silence, the legend grows, taking on a life of its own, becoming something larger and more powerful than the broken boy who created it. I am Isaac. I am the shadow that brought judgment to Louisiana. I am the ghost that haunts the dreams of oppressors everywhere. And in the end, I am free.